So I'm Christine George, and I am a research professor here at Curl, and I like Curl. I mean, this is our 25th year at Curl, and I think it's my 23rd or 24th year being at Curl. And everyone who's going to introduce themselves, who's on the panel, I realize as I'm looking, we have partnered with in doing research. And I just wanted to say this, that Curl started their research very early on in domestic violence. And it was because someone from Apna, Ghar came to Curl, and they were in a partnership with an organization called the Enterprising Kitchen. And they wanted to understand better and to actually make a case to their funder, needs of immigrant women who were victims of domestic violence. And that started a long process of going from one research project to the other. The next was with the mayor's office in domestic violence. We did a number of projects with that. One of those being in partnership with Joyce and the individuals from her organization. Jennifer has, as she will describe, has been very involved in funding us and supporting research around domestic violence. Adriana and the city has been our partner and in many cases. So, I mean, I'm just saying that there was, in some ways, this is a story about how we developed, and it became one of our largest, I don't want to even say portfolios, but one of our largest commitments and one of our largest partnerships to one of the communities in Chicago in terms of doing our work. So let's have everybody introduce themselves, and then we'll start the discussion. So, okay, so we'll start with Jennifer.
Thanks, Christine, and thanks for that history. It warms my heart to hear over the years all the work that Curl has done. So thank you for your support of this issue. It really means a lot. I'm Jennifer Rosenkranz, the Director of Grant Programs at Michael Reese, and I am responsible for our grant making in domestic violence, school-based behavioral health, and advocacy. And Michael Reese is a public foundation that advances equitable access to health solutions for all Chicagoans through grant making, incubation, and advocacy. And I am proud to say that we have been supporting domestic violence since our very first funding cycle. So our board has always recognized this as a significant health issue.
Joyce?
Joyce, you're still muted.
Good morning again. I'm Joyce Coffey. I'm the CEO of Family Rescue. We are a comprehensive domestic violence organization here in Chicago. We were the second domestic violence program to open here in Chicago, and we celebrated our 40th birthday.
Wow.
This month.
Leslie?
My name is Leslie Landis, and although it said on the announcement that I was the domestic violence court administrator for the domestic violence division, I recently retired. So I am the domestic violence renegade, trying to do my own thing and helping others. But I join Jennifer in saying that Curl has been an incredible collaborative research partner in a number of areas. With a number of areas that I've worked with them on, first at the Mayor's Office on Domestic Violence, subsequently at the Circuit Court. So I'm glad to be here and have a conversation about research.
Adriana?
Thank you. And thank you, Chris, for that introduction. We really celebrate our partnership here with the city and Curl. I am Adriana Camarda. Again, I have been the DV supervisor over DV programs for 3 years now. But before that, I was in the homeless division for 13 years. And so I embrace research. We use it here at the city, not only to sort of move our slow ship, but also to just to make an impact on domestic violence victims. Thank you.
Radhika.
Hi, I'm Radhika Sharma Gordon. I manage education and outreach at Apna Ghar. We were established about 31 years ago, originally to address domestic violence in South Asian communities, and since then have expanded and stepped into the breach and serve survivors of gender-based violence from more than 60 different countries. Though the majority of the survivors who come to us are foreign-born, we also work with other marginalized communities and have offices on the south side, on the north side, and serve and also partner with Swedish Hospital and have a counselor on site there. So we have benefited for a long time from partnerships with Loyola University, primarily with Curl, and continuing with Chris with the DB outcomes measures. And then we just have also, we're partnering now with the School of Ed at Loyola in their community schools program in Rogers Park and in Uptown. So have a long and very fruitful partnership that we cherish with Curl.
Well, let's start like do a historical question, like, you know, how over the years, and my gosh, 40 years, I'm sorry, but what has your been experience of research that you've done that's influenced you, that has worried you, whatever? So just people start talking, or else I will call on you.
Well, you know, being not a researcher, my answers may look a little different than how you guys talk in Curl, but research has always been a part of what has informed Family Rescue's service, development, and delivery. So one of the first things I remember doing when the agency, about a year or so after I came to Family Rescue, we were, at that point, we were just a shelter. We didn't have all of the programs that we have now: transitional housing, scattered site housing, court advocacy, our community outreach program. We didn't have all of that. We just had shelter, and we were trying to figure out what services did victims need and what should we be delving into to begin looking at. And so the first thing we did was to set up some focus groups with our clients. We actually had clients in shelter, but we also were serving non-residential clients as well. And the clients basically told us, if you really want to help us, rather than just having a shelter, you would be able to help us longer than 3 months or 4 months. You would have childcare, you would have assistance with helping us getting employment, you would have housing for us. That's what you would do. And we were like, okay. So continuing to talk and to call information from our clients, we, as a result, actually developed Ridgeland, which opened in 1991, I think one of the first transitional housing programs for victims of domestic violence in the country. But over the years, we kept looking at the various questions that we had. We got involved in violence prevention work in the schools, working with Paul Shuey. We were doing pre and post testing. We were in the schools for a whole year, and we would be in classes for a semester at a time. And we required teachers to be in the classroom with us, not just leave us and use that as a pre-period. And we would do pre and post tests. And then the next semester, we did a post test. And we would look at those students who were not actively in one of our cohorts at that point, but to see if there was a change in help-seeking behavior and how they felt about the use of personal violence in their relationships, et cetera, et cetera. And Paul Shuey was doing the analysis of the pre and post testing that we did at that point. Some years went on and we started working with UIC, and UIC was looking at occupational therapy and how could occupational therapists help in non-traditional settings, such as in domestic violence programs. And we set up a process with Dr. Chris Helfrich, who is no longer with UIC, and we did surveys. We're involved in surveys with clients, et cetera, and they began placing occupational therapists to address some of the issues that with parents and our moms and with our children. So that was another way. And of course, over the years, we've been involved in lots of surveys. We were involved in the survey with the Illinois Coalition Against Domestic Violence, I think back in 2004, 2005, when we we're looking at what victims were saying were gaps in services and what their challenges and needs were. And they were talking about the need for housing. They were talking about the need for support with co-parenting after domestic violence and the need for continued mental health services. And then, of course, we became involved with Christine and the whole work around what was success with domestic violence. Most of our funders' success to them was victims were not returning to their abusers and they were going on and being violence free. And we knew that that was not nuanced enough. And so how do you develop performance outcomes that you could then utilize in proposals to begin to articulate what some of the successes and concerns were. So over the years, there's been lots of ways and that we've been involved in research with here in Chicago.
Excuse me. I just wanted to say, Joyce, I mean, for some reason, what I remember most about doing research is when we did the shelter study that actually was motivated in part by the Mayor's Office on Domestic Violence. And it was the question of whether or not, why were people going to shelters? Was it to be confidential and anonymous and a way for their abusers? Was it because they because that there was no housing for them and they were homeless, that they needed support? And so we were trying to parcel that out. And so I remember when we were developing the survey, meeting with some of the shelter participants and former former people who you had provided services to, and figuring out what kind of questions we should ask and what were their realities, and I, for some reason, that really sticks in my head a lot, because what I felt is that the women were so, articulate, but they clearly shared their experiences, and I feel that was part of the culture of family rescue, that they felt that their voices were going to be heard.
Well, I think that that's also one of the hallmarks of Curl, the way your researchers approach gathering information, how to develop relationships with us as practitioners in the field, and how to develop relationships with those that we are trying to gather information from. Coming out of the 70s and the 80s, where research had often been done that basically raped communities of color and did not give back, there was no value added to the information that was given. That was certainly something that I appreciated in our relationship with you.
Thank you.
Mhm.
So Leslie?
Sure, Chris. I think that actually, I'm glad I'm following Joyce, because in thinking about this, one of the things I thought about was how wonderful it is that we've been able to do research with Curl. And I think one of the distinctions about Curl's work that I wanted to focus on is something Joyce mentioned, which is that in almost every research project that I've been involved in with Curl, I believe there was surveying and interviewing first person of survivors, not filtered through providers, not filtered through police. And it's not always easy to get that kind of contact safely with people who have experienced intimate partner violence. So I really appreciated that in many different ways, that was the goal. And I thought about a couple examples, and I'll try to keep this brief, Chris, but for me, way back in the day, Joyce, you might remember that the network even started early on, before we had staff, with police surveys of the programs to try to establish just how poor the police response was at that time. Now, this was very early on, and people like the Law Enforcement Study Group really stepped in as a fairly radical group at that time dealing with law enforcement issues, and really put that on the map for us in Chicago a little bit. I also remembered I walked down memory lane a little bit, because I remembered that we also did at ICJIA, I participated in the Chicago Women's Health Risk Study, which I raise only because it was an instance where, again, survivors were solicited and interviewed. And what I liked about that research, and why I wanted to focus on it for a second, was that it talked to victims who did not access service. Mm-hmm. There were people who came into medical sites, and we specifically asked those who went no farther in linking to any other services why that was, what inhibited them. And it was the first time I ever saw anybody approach it that way. Not what brought you into services, but what caused you not to take any of these doorways. And that was really helpful. I also want to take a second and talk about the helpline evaluation. Curl was funded by, I think that was Office on Violence Against Women, to evaluate the 24-hour City of Chicago helpline before it really became the State of Illinois hotline. And again, a key feature that I would point out there was that it was about making contact with users and finding out whether their interaction was helpful, and then following up to see if they actually utilized the resource. And we learned that the helpline, even when they didn't follow up with the resource, that interaction was beneficial and helpful. And, and many other things. But I was trying to think of findings that resulted in change, Chris. So I thought about that. Of course, I will say just two more things. One is that we are involved with Curl right now in a major evaluation of the Family Court Enhancement Project, which was a federally funded project at the Domestic Violence Court that led to attention being given to the issues of shared children, supervised visitation, and coming to parenting agreements as part of an order of protection. We are in the throes of that. I don't know how the people at Curl are walking on water, because they are just going through and slogging through lots and lots of data and coming up with really good results that I think can inform the operation of the court, and I think more ultimately than just the operation of the court. There were also a couple other quick studies that happened at the court with looking at the substance abuse patterns among perpetrators or those who cause harm, and also PAPE program successes, all of which leads to areas of research that I want to see in answer to later questions. I think I'll just close with saying that I also thought that there was real benefit early on in learning how to map, both qualitatively and in terms of working with the police department to map where calls for service were coming from, and to overlay that with where services existed and to see where there was a mismatch and not a match. And that really guided a lot of the policy and evidence-based policy recommendations of the Mayor's Office on Domestic Violence. I could obviously go on and on and on, so I will stop to let others make contributions on this question.
Apna has benefited in many ways from partnerships with Loyola and specifically with Curl, but two that majorly stand out, of course, were the multi-year study in the early 2000s that Curl led that helped, that again used mixed methodology in gathering information, speaking with survivors, speaking with experts here and in other states, and helping to identify the issues, the unaddressed issues, the issues that survivors are struggling with the most, and to help create this sociological model of the various levels from individual engagement to policy engagement that Apna utilizes in working with individuals, with the communities in which they live, with the systems that they have to navigate, and then again, policies and funding that have an impact on them. Also, the domestic violence outcome measures study helped both to identify that, yes, shared parenting is a continued struggle for survivors. And second, that it helped to emphasize the need for guidance and support in addressing, supervised visitation, legal issues, and a variety of other needs that just continue with a lot of the survivors that we work with. And there are survivors who are still engaging with us 10, 15 years later, because they form a partnership with us and they come to us, with a variety of needs. And so, and then sometimes, because of the problems that their children are having in relationships and the violence that they're experiencing, sometimes at the hands of their children's spouses. And so anyway, those are some of the ways that we've benefited. We've also benefited from research done by a visiting scholar from England who helped to identify that Apna, it's not cultural competence we engage in, but the approach of cultural humility, and helping us to sort of frame and understand and be able to articulate and then train others in this whole approach of, we come to an encounter with a survivor with our expertise, our shared knowledge, our experience, knowing about our resources, but there comes a point at which we have to lay that down and sit back and become the learner. And that each client, it's up to them to tell us about their history, about their culture and how they experience their culture and their heritage and their history of trauma. So without any assumptions, we learn. And that's very tiny nutshell, cultural humility. And so they helped us to identify and give a name to the approach that we utilize. We have also benefited greatly. I've benefited from public health students who, wade through all of our data. I said, I have 7 40-hour trainings worth of evaluation data that I've collected but have not touched, except for looking at some of the comments and using some of those to change and improve the trainings. And God bless her, she entered all of that into Excel spreadsheets. And then we were able to really make sense of it and identify the weaknesses, what works that we want to continue. And that was just so incredibly helpful to us. So those are just some of the many ways that research has helped, including also early researchers who looked at the specific cultural needs of many of the immigrant and refugee survivors whom we serve.
For the city, I think that the culmination of this research over time has sort of led us to this place where we are today, that some victims don't want to criminalize their partner and need the option of providing services or connecting their partner to services. And so the city has really seen a gap because unless you're criminalized, you don't have access to PAPE, right? And so we, through the Department of Health, put out, services for the abuser, and want to really connect it to our SVSE, our supervised visitation programs. We think that that is really a good collaboration so that abusers can, seeing them as victims as well, is a brand new light to us. And hopefully they won't go and just abuse another partner. So that is a culmination of some of our, our work with Pearl, and other research and other data. So I just wanted to provide that as an example that the city is listening, but it takes us a while to turn that ship. So I just wanted to put that out there too.
Thanks, Adriana. We're thrilled that you all are supporting the project for partners who engage in abuse. For Michael Reese, as I mentioned, we have supported domestic violence direct services from the beginning. And I think pretty quickly we realized that we could, by supporting research, we could help create systems change and kind of hopefully move, I know we're going to talk about this a little bit later, but hopefully push a little bit more beyond sort of the traditional model of services. And two projects that I think have been mentioned in different ways. We've supported the outcome study, the network's outcome study that followed up with survivors 6 months after services. And around that same time, there was the needs assessment that was supported by Michael Reese and Crown that was conducted by the Social Impact Research Center at Heartland. And together, both those projects, as Michael Reese went through strategic planning several years ago, while we use that funding to support the field, we also used it to modify our own grant making. And to the results of those studies really made us change our guidelines to say that we're going to support cross-sector collaboration, recognizing the need for broader models and for agencies that there are a lot of agencies that are addressing survivors but don't recognize them as such, and so the need to partner across systems. And then also another thing that came out of those is really the need for long-term support, that survivors need the mental health trauma that they have from the experiences that they've had, that doesn't heal quickly, and that it takes a lot of counseling and a lot of support to get through that and to improve their lives and to help their children through those experiences. So through the research that we helped support, those became kind of two areas that we were particularly interested in supporting.
Am I on mute? No, I'm not on mute. Okay. In sort of refreshing, our memories of all of this and the rich amount of work that has been in the field, if you look back and think about, there seems to be one of the strains in your discussions have been that the quote model has changed in some ways, and maybe not in others, in terms of what should DV services look like, what should policy look like, and so how do you see that happening? And what do you think a model or the service model should look like now? And what can we do? What questions should we ask? What work should we do to help move that forward? A small question.
When you talk about the DV model of services, I mean, typically, we think about the shelter, the advocacy, the support groups, the legal advocacy support, that kind of thing as a model of services. But I've often wondered, and those things developed, over time out of different ways that victims were moving through systems and the lack of response, or however the response was to those victims, and then developing services that would address those. But sometimes I also think that after years, I mean, we're 40 some odd years down the line with this work, that the services themselves become a, what's the word I want to use? They become a box in which victims operate. And so because these are the services that are there, that's what they ask for. Which is not necessarily the same thing as, well, if I could have anything I wanted, what would that be? And so, you know, as the years have gone on and we look at, well, what do service models look like? For family rescue, the question has started to evolve into how do we interact in the community and engage in communities to provide to provide information and input and whatever, without necessarily saying, I want to identify these number of victims and we're going to provide these number of services and we're going to aggregate this data in this way and we're going to put it into the InfoNet, et cetera. What are some other ways that we could be involved with victims and with abusers? There's been lots of questions for us about so many assumptions, and I don't know if that's now, so I won't go into it a whole lot, but there are so many assumptions that we started with all those years ago. Are those assumptions still valid? Do we need to do research to see if they still have validity? And if so, how? And if not, what has changed? And does that open the door for us to experiment with different service models, different ways of delivering services, different ways of interacting not only with victims, but with those who cause harm?
Joyce, I think you've raised such an important point, because I feel like one of the challenges here is that, you know, we say people do what they're funded to do, and the funding here is often so restrictive that it really limits the creativity that service providers are looking for. And then it also, you know, when you have to report to a foundation, and we try not to do this at Michael Reese, when we have very restrictive, you need to report this and that, whether it's, you know, the private funders or the public funders, it really does limit the ability to branch out. And we all hear the statistic of, you know, 1 in 3 women, and we know so many of those people are not showing up for services. And so there needs to be new models to address that. One project that we recently supported was in collaboration with the network, is a report on called Meeting the Needs of Survivors, Reimagining Domestic Violence Services in Illinois. And it looked at how funding has been used around the country more creatively, and you know, being able to hopefully loosen some of the restrictions. We've been trying to do some advocacy to loosen some of the restrictions and hopefully provide support for some of these models that are so desperately needed.
We, you know, absolutely, you know, bouncing off of what both of you have talked about, survivors walk through so many doors, you know, whether it's the library, whether it's WIC, whether it's their children's school, whether it's the laundromat. There's all sorts of institutions that they engage in. And, you know, one of our hopes is that no matter what door you walk through, if you are a survivor, that system will be prepared to, at the very least, do some cursory but meaningful assessment of the danger that you're in, and linking you. On any one night in Chicago, there are more domestic violence survivors in homeless shelters than there are in domestic violence shelters, because we have whatever, I can't remember, I think 150 domestic violence shelter beds, even fewer now that we're social distancing in the domestic violence shelters. But the number of survivors who are going to homeless shelters is significant. We need to engage and find out how we can most effectively ensure that if you are no matter what type of shelter you're going to, you will receive information that will have an impact on you, and you will leave a little more empowered with information and linkage to support and resources. That's just one of something I'll touch on later in terms of it's a laundry list of types of research we'd love to see being done.
I think the interesting thing that we walk away from now is looking back at the research that's been done. We do sort of know that a lot of the models did contribute to a sense of increased safety if they used what we're calling the traditional models. That came out of the outcome study. So if the goal was to increase safety, it was being met. And so I'm not saying let's just get rid of all of that, because there is some benefits being utilized and measured out of the mouths of people who use it, that serves as benefit. So I don't know that it's new models. I think it's enhanced models, or it's enhanced collaboration. And that can take on all kinds of meanings. But for me, having worked in the carceral area for the last part of my career, I have to say that this move away from carceral to some sort of community or restorative or transformative responses to domestic violence takes on a great deal of interest to me, because theoretically I am 100% there. And then we start to parse it out, and I try to figure out possible unintended consequences and so on. And we're in the middle of all of that. And in fact, the White House is actually conducting some listening tours on what it means to respond to those who've caused harm. So these things are catching up. I'm glad Chicago, and the city in particular, took that on and is looking at it. But in the area of research to get us there, I think there are two things. One is we really don't, when we talk about prevention and community, we seem, I think, to focus on working with teens and prevention in schools and so forth and so on. When we were at the Mayor's Office on Domestic Violence, we conducted a community organizing project. We sent people out into the community, many of you remember this, meeting with stakeholders in the community. They gave us tons of ideas, and then they just languished. Nobody was there to help them move forward on any of what they perceived as community responses to domestic violence. They didn't partner well with the existing provider community. And, you know, there's lots of reasons why that is. We don't have to debate that right now. But what we didn't really learn or gain is what it means to have a community sanction that is not about a carceral sanction, and how we draw those who need that and that support beyond sanction, who have caused harm, into some kind of change activity or action. And I'm here to tell you that while I support an increased focus on working with those who've caused harm, I'm very anxious that we need to do a lot of research and a lot of talking before we just go out and start developing those models. We don't know what those men need. We don't know what motivates them into services. We do know that victims want them in there. We do know that, especially when they share children. We don't know the nexus of that with the doorway of supervised visitation. And we don't know what the implications of all that will be when it's not mandated in any way. What happens? So my goal would be to begin to look at what have been the changes in community perception or social norm and value. If the community is going to become the group that sanctions, then I would like to feel some understanding that the people who are coming into that are not going to cause harm. And, you know, I work with many faith leaders, for example, that I would have sent a victim of domestic violence or a person who's caused harm to with no worries. I worked with others that I had lots of worries. So when we talk about community, we sort of have to gauge where that's nested, what they're bringing into it, how they can support those who've caused harm, and also what do those who caused harm need and what's going to motivate them into change. And all of that, in my mind, mixes into this intersectionality and gender conversation that we're having around the country and in domestic violence specifically. I don't think it's wise to move away from all gender analysis on this stuff, even though I totally support the need to increase intersectionality understanding. So the areas where we can do research in that, I think, are great. It's not enough, in my view, and I'm free to speak my mind. It's not enough, in my view, just to put money out there and say, we're going to start funding, we're going to start services for those who caused harm. What's that look like? Based on what research? Who did you talk to? What focus groups have you done? All of that stuff. All right, I will get off my soapbox. But I think that I think that the pertinent issues right now, research into homelessness, research into economic, all of those barriers that we all know, we need that. But what's more prescient right now, I think, is this question of community engagement, community sanction, how carceral fits with that, and what motivates stages of change.
Leslie, I want to say two things. One is I agree with you. I don't think it's a matter of either or. I think this is what we have at hand.
I agree.
Where are some other things? Where I question something that you said, when I think in the beginning, when we were providing services, developing services for victims, we didn't do that on a huge body of research. In fact, there wasn't any, very little. And so why would we say that would be the prerequisite before we begin experimentation with working with those who do cause harm?
Because the risks are very high.
The risk, yes, but the risks were high in the beginning.
Yes, they were.
Nothing changed. But the questions are, I don't know if we're moving into that, but the questions around the ethical issues that are involved in how we approach some of these questions, Leslie, that you're raising are clearly there. We can't ignore them. I mean, it would be dangerous for us to do that, and dangerous for those that we serve to do that. But the rigidity of how we have defined who a victim is, how we have defined who a perpetrator is. Today, I have questions about that, especially when we know that a lot of the people who cause harm were victims at earlier periods in their life. So when we set up policy, how does research then help us develop and define policy that will allow us to be more flexible in how we approach these issues? Becomes a question for me.
That's better put than the way I put it. But I don't think we're in disagreement.
Right. No, we're not.
I think also that then as the city, we should also, when we're putting out models, like you said, without too much research on it, that we collaborate with a researcher like we've done.
Right.
And so, but better to put it out there and try than not to move at all. So, and will it be a learning? Will it fail? Maybe, but we will have learned something at least from the process.
Absolutely.
And you also used a word that you use the word motivation. What motivates? Well, if we're listening to victims and they want their partner to get help and there's nothing out there, at least we've provided an outlet for that. Just like there are some victims who want to prosecute or whatever, and it's appropriate or whatever, this is another option.
Absolutely. Defining accountability, defining safety and long-term, even after folks have left formal services. I think also, a recommendation for meaningful and constructive research is when survivors are engaged, what my executive director has taught me when we were talking last night before this panel, some of them get very emotionally invested in the research and want to know what's happening with it. And then the research study ends and then, that's it. And sometimes the participants are like, okay, well, that was nice. I got a gift card to Target, et cetera, which is a great step from nothing at all. But more can be done in terms of, all right, these are the findings. Let's talk about how you can go forward with this if you'd like to. And here are some current initiatives and campaigns that you can engage in if you want to continue and be committed to addressing this. We're not just going to leave it here and you're just wondering whatever happened with that. I want to do more, or I want to do something around this. So ensuring that a research study that engages participants, engages survivors, also ends on a note of, and here is how you can continue. Even though we're gone as researchers, we need that for some who, apparently get, very emotionally invested and kind of riled up by the study and want to do something more and take it a step further.
I was thinking of two things or two strands, and one is, who and what is the community? And where is the voice of the community in that? Just like we don't understand enough of, why does someone abuse? What is it in their history or in the context of their life, and all of that. Which we've been talking about. What creates a safe or supportive community that allows people to be empowered in such a way that that they're supported in not doing any harm or in not being harmed. I notice, that, and I think that that's a question, and how we get the voice of the community into that discussion. And something what Radhika said made me think about, how do we disseminate this information? How do we even shape the questions for the research in a way that's going to communicate to what is really in people's minds, and what is the relationship of community safety and other and domestic violence and all of those issues together. I know this sounds really big, but somehow I think, it in some ways, as in many issues, we've created a silo, right, for domestic violence. Mm. And there's no way not to in some ways, but the question is how, in a lot of ways, just like homelessness is really not about homelessness, it's really about poverty. It seems to me that it's so with domestic violence. It's about the individual experiences, but it's about something larger. And how do we get to that? How do we have a community discussion on that?
Chris, you've opened up a can of worms, and your comments are so expansive. You ask, how do you define community? That question alone could keep us here for the next 2 hours. And how we, and in addition to that, each one of us move through different communities. We have different families or clans that we, I have my family, I have my sister girlfriend family, I have my service provider family, I've got my co-workers, I've got my, we move through different communities, and each of those communities have an impact on me. And so I'm assuming that that's true for others as well. So when we're trying to talk about, for instance, how do we talk about how communities can develop accountability models for, whatever, for those who harm, et cetera. What community are we talking about? And how does that community impact an individual abuser? And it's just as problematical when we're talking about that side of the coin as the problem that we've had on the victim side of services, where what we do with victims is so individual. We develop individual service plans. It's not a cookie cutter service plan that here's a service plan and everybody that we serve is going to go through this like this. It's not like that. And it's also not like that for abusers. So how to narrow the conversation down into questions that become researchable is I don't know, a challenge. I'll leave that to our august doctor there.
I think that one other approach that would be helpful would be to engage and support those of us who are already in communities to hold focus groups and people who already have in-reach, people who already have credibility in communities, to also ask some of the questions and engage community members and find out the terminology, the perceptions, the best ways to reach, et cetera. I know that years ago, Chicago Foundation for Women did that in addressing reproductive health and access. And they gave many grants to a variety of organizations to hold focus groups in their communities. And it yielded some really fabulous, really, really interesting results. And so it was organizations doing the questioning. The one thing that was missing from that was a training on best practices in holding an informal focus group. That there needed to be that kind of training and support for all of us who were holding focus groups. So that's just another way that community organizations and service providers can engage community. Also, Northwestern University in their medical system has ARC, and it's all about community-based participatory research partnerships. And they have these mini grants, and the mini grants are very realistic. It's just take a year to get to know this researcher from our institution, and you, community-based organization, and the communities you serve, and nothing more than getting to know one another and understanding each other's approaches, and then exploring what type of research you want to do. But here's some support to fund buying the coffee and everything else to host conversations with community members, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, laying the groundwork that you all know is needed before being able to engage in longer term research projects. But that was really helpful. And I was just reading a fabulous article from about Casa de Esperanza in Minnesota and the National Latino Network, and what they've done with researchers in engaging community members that yielded, the realization that Latinx males, no big surprise, really wanted to hear from other Latinx males about domestic violence, et cetera. But they're using this, community-centered, evidence-based practices, sort of research, which is really fascinating. I want us to kind of look more at how institutions and communities and service providers who we're all to differing levels, community-based organizations. There are a lot of domestic violence organizations that aren't really deeply engaged in the communities where they're located. So anyway, some of those supporting some of that initial groundwork that needs to be laid in the partnerships that need to be developed between researchers and service providers and communities, I think is also a really important approach to consider.
Well, I have one more question, and then
can
And
I
then-
quickly
yeah,
say something,
yeah,
Chris?
definitely.
Can I throw something in here? And that is that I don't disagree with anything that anybody's saying, but I wanted to make sure that we do research that might focus on the question of why victims or survivors of intimate partner violence continue to be met with a certain degree of disbelief. Okay, generally speaking, I think that there's still an atmosphere of when they come forward, they're not always believed. And that was some pretty early baseline work that we did in domestic violence. And I think that that's what I witnessed in court, that we still have this persistent assumption about these relationships as somehow not being presented as they actually are. Okay, so they have that. I'm not doing very good job on explaining what I'm thinking, but that, Joyce, I see you laughing. And the second thing is, why are people who have caused harm not seeking support? Or are they? And we don't know where. And again, what would draw them in? And so I think that we have to look, just like we looked at where were victims going, what doorways were victims going through and disclosing, what doorways are the people who are causing harm going through? And what messages are they getting when they walk through that door? And can they get support and not just punitive response? And that's why I've been such a proponent of supervised visitation for lots of reasons, but also for the reason that I think it provides an incubator spot where it's not a criminal sanction, but it's bringing men into service where we might be able to build relationship and do some research, focus groups and so forth that might lend and help us answer these questions. Because I think those are truly the most present questions for us.
I agree with you, Leslie, and I've been thinking, some of us were probably at the network's breakfast earlier this week, and all week I have been thinking about the woman who was the caterer, who is a survivor. And she stood up and said, I am a survivor. You know, I catered the food here, which was wonderful. And there was nowhere for my abuser to get help. And I didn't want to call the police, and I didn't want, I didn't want to end the relationship. I just wanted the violence to stop. And then there was nowhere for him to get help. And I tried and I tried. And I think that's not a news story for any of us in this field, but it just has stuck in my mind all week that we need to have more services for this woman and her partner.
Which, before Chris jumps in with her last question she said she had.
Well, that's you're actually answering it, but anyway.
Oh, okay. Jennifer, that is part of where I started this morning when I said we developed a movement based on certain philosophical underpinnings, certain beliefs that we had about what the reality, what the dynamic of domestic violence looked like. And I'm not saying that those are wrong. I'm just saying I want to re-examine them. I want to look at them. And one of the things, one of the examples I could give for that, I could give several. I'll give two. Just to give you an idea of how you can get into sticky wicket water real fast when you decide to experiment. When Family Rescue decided that it was going to provide proactive outreach to victims who were calling 911, we got severe backlash from the domestic violence community. And even today, there's still backlash about how dare you. But I can tell you, remembering state's attorney from San Diego, they were here in Chicago and they were doing a seminar or something. And one of the things that she said is that they got backlash like that too. And she said, but everything that all their research showed them that the worst thing we could do was to do nothing, that it was better to be proactive in our outreach than to do nothing. But the other, so that was one, but another example of how our hesitancy to examine what we believe to be true comes with when I want to say it's the St. Pius program that has the whole couples counseling piece. And that is like, oh, hell no, you shouldn't. You can't do that. But they have done it and have been doing it and have figured out ways to do that in response to the population that they're working with and to do it safely. Now, they have a lot of protocols as to how they do that and how people move through and all that kind of thing. But they are met with such resistance. We're not going to give you any money, to help fund you that because that's wrong, blah, 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 blah. And those resistances keep us from moving forward. Now, I'm not saying that we should just carte blanche, just, throw, everything 4 sheets to the wind. But what I'm saying is we have to remain open enough to question whether or not some of these things that we believe to be true, if they really are.
Absolutely.
If they really are.
Absolutely. That is one thing that we in the domestic sector need to address is our knee-jerk reactions and throwing out the baby with the bathwater when somebody comes to us with a suggestion. I remember years ago working with a violence prevention organization, looking at family strengthening and looking at, evidence-based approaches for addressing youth recidivism, et cetera. And wanting to see whether or not those programs like Leslie, multisystemic family therapy, and functional family therapy that had really strong outcomes in terms of reducing both the targeted youth recidivism as well as their siblings problematic behaviors, how we could merge those with introduce a domestic violence approach into those set models. It was going to mess with fidelity, of course, but we're just beginning to question that. And people just came at us saying, because they thought that we were saying, let's do, it's okay to do family counseling with a survivor and the person who's harming them. And that's not at all what we were saying, but we do sometimes have these knee-jerk reactions, and we sometimes can be very static, and sometimes we can be, well-earned, in some cases, mistrust. And so that is work that we need to do, because yes, Joyce, I totally agree with you. We should be cautious, absolutely, but we really need to be able to sit down and listen and talk and learn from other sectors and be willing to go into some uncomfortable discussions and consider, okay, so what can be done to ensure safety and accountability while trying this new approach? And let's not just immediately reject, some of the innovations that are being suggested.
I agree. And I think that there are many valid and possibly highly beneficial innovations that are being suggested. And I think we should check our assumptions, Joyce. I think we should go back and review them and check them. But that doesn't mean that all of them were wrong. And what we need to do is figure out what needs to stay intact and that is girded in the lived experiences of the people that we have served over the years and the lessons we've learned and where we have screwed up, those lessons too, and then look at it. Because right now I'm seeing it sort of I'm hearing it not in this group, but I'm hearing it outside where it's an either or, as you said, Joyce. It's a get rid of that model, get rid of that gender analysis, move away from carceral, and move completely towards a community restorative, balanced approach. And I think that the truth is somewhere in the middle. And I think I agree with you, we need to check those assumptions, which still apply, which don't apply, which were ill-informed, all of that. I don't see that happening And
Well,
I would, sorry, Chris, go.
No, I was gonna say, I mean, I just want to say you answered my last question, which is what were your summarizing thoughts? And in some ways, these are your summarizing thoughts. I do want to open it up to everyone to see what questions or discussions or comments they might have. And so let's do that. We've been so comprehensive that
There is one in the chat question.
yeah. All right. Where is it? I can't, Teresa, do you?
There's a question here. It says, is the disbelief, to respond to Leslie, is the disbelief issue part of a broader issue that happens when a lower status person claims harm by a higher status person?
Oh,
And that had to do with
He's saying people aren't believed.
the
women
people
aren't
aren't
believed.
believed. Right. And then, I went to a conference, Evaluate conference a couple years ago, and, they had that whole start by believing thing, and the initiative, and the attorneys of the group were saying, you can't start by believing. In the legal system, you have to be at a more neutral place. But to respond to the question that I see in the chat, I think that it is a broader issue, and even broader than whether it's the classes of people who the perpetrator or the victim is. I think it's even broader than that. In terms of when we talk about having a gender lens that we look at certain realities with, there are just a lot of things that women say that are just disbelieved, right out of the chute. And so where does that come from? If we're crying, that doesn't mean that what I'm saying, that I'm irrational, or that I'm no longer logical, or that I'm not objectively describing to you what an experience is, or whatever the case may be. So this whole thing about disbelief, there's a piece of it to me that has to do with to discount a reality so that you can continue to deny the reality is part of what I think is going on.
And that's even if you're able to communicate for folks who are English language learners and aren't even able to voice what's happening, or the translation and interpretation is being done by somebody else. There's not even a chance to disbelieve, because you don't even really know what they're saying if you are a responding person up to the scene and you and somebody else is interpreting for a survivor. And so, that's just, there's the gender lens, there's the immigration lens, there's the LGBTQI lens, disability, all of these things that also contribute to various groups of people who have been disempowered, who aren't believed.
If I may, I just wanted to say something real quick. I just really appreciated the conversation around creating programming for abusers, and I'm sorry, I'm new to DV specific conversations. So if I'm using incorrect language around stuff that's commonly used, please feel free to correct me. I'm a social work student, so thank you for letting me be here to learn from you all. But I just really appreciate that conversation, in particular around research and what's out there, and the comparison to earlier, and I don't know which decades you were referring to, but when there wasn't research out there, like for research-minded people, we want to know what's been done, but sometimes, if the consensus is to move forward, then we move forward without it. And so I just really appreciated that, and all of it, but in general, that particular conversation and the transparency among all of you while having it was awesome. So thanks.
Well, thank you.
Somebody's going to grab you as an intern.
Yeah, I'm in BSW now. I'm at Youth Crossroads in Berwyn.
I'm like, what's his name?
Yeah. I'm sure you'll see me around, especially after I graduate. So thanks.
But, the point, we need more men in this movement who are committed to this issue. And it goes, I think, back to the not being believed, and the, more men need to engage in this, because, people just want the abuse to stop. And until men partner in that, it's going to be really hard to achieve it. So thank you for your work.
Other questions, comments?
Hi,
thoughts?
yes, Mary here, hi. I'd like to go back to the question that I posted, because in the discussion, I was really thinking about the issue of, how primarily women survivors of domestic violence are not believed, but then we know children who are abused are not believed. And then, when you think about George Floyd and all the racial violence that goes on, that tends to not be believed unless it's incredibly blatant. And even then, January 6th, for example, and then the objections to teaching critical race theory, because we can't uncover, what, not that it's even being taught in elementary or high schools, but that we can't even uncover it. And so, and I do appreciate, Radhika's addition of the intersectionality issues, because that sort of delegitimizes the claims even further when you add that component to it as well. But I'm just wondering, how do we start to address this, being informed by these broader issues, but applying it to the domestic violence community?
I know
You
that,
partner.
yeah, partnering, and then also just sort of establishing, like, yes, this is happening in your community. When bullying prevention programs go into schools, the really good ones first do a climate survey and the report back to the school. All right, you might not think bullying is is an issue. Well, we've asked students, and 4 out of 5 times the teachers don't even recognize the bullying they're experiencing, and this is how many students are experiencing bullying. So I think sometimes going into communities and establishing that, like, well, this is how often it's happening. It's not happening in that other community, it's happening here. I mean, that would be just one way of starting to break through the disbelief or the denial.
Believe it or not, I think storytelling goes a long way towards that as well. It's not research, but in storytelling, where people are expressing the depth of what it is that they have experienced, and being able to share those stories broadly helps us. It helps break down the barriers that I think we have naturally to somebody else's experience. That's not my experience. That couldn't possibly be true. That's part of how you have a tendency to approach things. But then after you start hearing these stories, you're like, no, that hasn't been my reality, but listen to what they're saying. And when you begin listening, then you start seeing elements of those stories in so many different places. And it begins to help build credibility for people who haven't had it. The other thing is, I think that who controls the information has the power. So if we can control the stories, if we can control the research, if we can control the dissemination of the research, where does the results of this research go? To what audiences do we target that information? It also, there's a power dynamic in that whole entire thing.
Okay, I'm going to jump in on that, because that's you're talking to us at Curl on that one there, like really pushing researchers to think about how we, going back to storytelling, how we tell the story, that the data, to whom, in what forms. And I think I think we can all agree it's not a one size fits all. I think we've some of the good stuff coming out of some of the bigger data mining is the way in which we can use more inventive and creative ways to share the data and tell those stories, and then those connect up with other kinds of storytelling. So I think that's a critical part there.
It would also be nice to see some sort of a continuum of the research. that, like, I was thinking, Radhika, about what you were saying, like these one-shot deals, and some of the people who are surveyed or interviewed feel engaged in that, and then it's done. And that seems to be true because, for example, on this one research project that I'm engaged with Chris on now, all I could think about yesterday when some of those findings were being presented to an advisory group was, okay, that's great. Now we got to do this with that data, you know, and we need to find out this with that data. Answer this question. They actually laugh at me because they're like, we can't drill down as much as you want to, Leslie, right? The data only goes so far, but it would be nice to see some repository where some of that becomes built off of what preceded it. So that the momentum continues.
Oh, absolutely. I think one of those, very practical ways that we can do this is by engaging in the research. Those people with their feet on the ground, with their ears to the ground, et cetera. City Colleges Chicago has started a community health worker curriculum. When we can work with folks who are constantly, community health workers, interpreters, folks who are constantly engaged with a lot of the targeted communities. And so there can be ongoing two-way engagement beyond just some of the targeted surveying and interviewing. But yeah, Leslie, that would be one way that we can have a continued relationship and begin to drill down, because we're going to continue to engage you. And, our community health workers are going to go out and talk to the community, and then they're going to go to the, public library and be able to download the information if they don't have a computer at home. And it's immediately go into, our common data bank, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, there's some really practical ways that we can be able to go back, and it might not be every same respondent who responded to the first survey that led to further questioning, but I do think that we just need to look at developing some of these ongoing relationships that engage us in communities where there can be that two-way, we ask questions, but they're also informing us and putting things on our radar screen, that we're not always aware of.
Rachel,
Hi, everybody. My name is Rachel. I'm with Michael Reese as well. And I thank you all for this rich and provocative discussion. And I'm wondering, I have a lot of questions, but I'll see if I can articulate them. Building off of what Dr. Sharma just said with regards to the role of community health workers and other community organizers, and the opportunity to develop this bidirectional stream of training where you're both disseminating information, but also learning from the community, whether it's through training of community organizers, violence interrupters, community health workers. I mean, there's a big swell right now with regards to public health and the role of hyperlocal trusted messengers. And there are systems going on in the ecosystem, such as the health equity zones, to create a sort of a network of organizers and organizations that can be equipped to disseminate information. And, to the point you're saying in terms of the power of the narrative and who controls the narrative, I'm curious as to what your vision or desire is for the DV sector to impart that training. What does it look like to work with a nexus of community organizers working on health messaging in general that may not be social workers or oriented to a specific type of service, but many services? And in that same vein, from the community, there's also a lot of opportunity for anchor institutions and hospitals. They're required to conduct community health needs assessments every so many years. And I'm wondering how the DV sector is sort of organizing and applying pressure to the hospitals to respond to the community health needs assessments that they identify. And there's bidirectional opportunity for communication and sharing research and learnings with hospitals as well. and they have a different type of power. So I don't even know what the question is there.
No, I think you got me thinking, Rachel, and I'm sorry, I'll stop soon, but identifying those folks who are really engaging a lot. So the community health workers, the ESL instructors, the teachers and counselors at the schools, the folks who get approached often by folks needing more information. I mean, ESL instructors at Albany Park Community Center, the number one topic that immigrants and refugees would come to them with would be healthcare related, and so identifying those people who have continued, who have ongoing engagement in communities and working with them, that's one thing. And then I'm forgetting what the rest of your question is, so I'm going to stop talking and try to remember.
The other thing that I know, Radhika, you know this but there are efforts underway to train community street outreach workers on domestic violence, and one is to address the intersection between community violence and domestic violence, but also just to spread that knowledge. And it's been challenging, but I think there's a lot of potential there, but it has been very challenging for obviously street outreach workers, and those organizations are responding to a huge increase in violence, and getting their attention to this issue is a little challenging, but I think it is one way to work in community in a different way and to kind of spread the word.
I was reacting to some, Rachel, what you were saying by thinking there is a certain level of hesitancy. Maybe it's academic narcissism, or maybe it's training narcissism. I'm not exactly sure what it is, but in the domestic violence community, there's been this hesitancy about who is able to share information, who is able to do the work. And part of that has come from the need to protect the integrity of service providers, where very often that has been denigrated. But if we move beyond that, and we're embracing the broadest dissemination of information possible, to be if that is a value, a community value, that to have access to the information and to develop those who are the ones who gather and who disseminate that information, that becomes very important. We are often concerned about, well, if you give somebody information, what are they going to do with it? How are they going to help? Are they going to hurt? Are they going to make a situation worse, etc.? There's a lot of those kinds of feelings that swirl around. When we were years ago, there was a group that had community health workers that were in the community, and they came to Family Rescue, and they asked us if we could provide them domestic violence 101 training, because they were coming into contact with domestic violence in the homes. That's not why they were going. They were talking about high blood pressure and diabetes and, whatever the case may be, but this is what they were coming across and saying. And so, we did the domestic violence 101 training, etc. And I'll never forget it, because I thought it was funny. In the domestic violence community, we were talking about how we could never go into anybody's homes because how dangerous that was. And yet, here were these people that we had just, done, completed this training, and that's what they were doing. So what? It's not dangerous for them. So, again, this gets back to, just our perceptions. Those perceptions came from somewhere. I'm not trying to just poo-poo them and say that they're silly. They weren't. They came from some realities of stuff that happened. But at the same time, we have, some decades down the road now, and there are other ways that information can get out into the community. What people do with information once they have it may not be what I thought they would do with it or what I had intended that they would do with it, But does that then mean that that information shouldn't be disseminated? No. It just means that we have to be open to how not only individuals, neighborhoods, communities, groups, how we utilize the information. And once that information is out there, it goes in all, different kinds of ways and has intended and unintended consequences.
Well, Joyce, if I could just comment as a quick follow-up and say that when you may recall that when we were at the mayor's office on domestic violence, we did that big community outreach program. We had summits and town halls and focus groups, and it engaged people at the community level. It was not the providers. It was, in fact, business leaders. It ran the gamut. It went beyond the usual set of suspects. And I was astonished at how quickly community members, neighborhood-based community members, took to the non-denial of this as a problem in their area and took to identifying what resources were in their immediate area, what assets they had to apply to that problem, and put together action plans that shouldn't have created any issues for anybody. And then at the same time, you may remember there was huge PR around promoting the use of the hot helpline. We called it a helpline for a reason, to encourage people to call it. And early on, shockingly, those who caused harm called the line.
Yeah.
The primary referral after police back in the day was concerned family and friends. And that concerned family and friends learned about the helpline and got those materials because the city did broad-based distribution and brought lots of people under that tent. And then it just went away, much to my frustration. And no lessons were learned. And if there were people that probably felt betrayed by that engagement in the community, I wouldn't blame them, because they fully engaged with us. And then there was no one that picked it up and took it to the next phase.
So Leslie, it's not true that there were no lessons learned. There were lessons learned. But I will say this to you, because I'm still angry with you to this day, because because I said, Leslie, where's the book? Because I wanted you. I'm like, girl, you need to.
Oh, I'm retired. I'm retired now. Yeah, maybe that's true. But you're right. That was a good instance. You're right, Joyce, and you're right for giving me taking me to task for that, because Radhika, you are also correct in that the distribution of those findings and that work wasn't widespread. It didn't go very far, and that's part of the problem. We didn't publish it. We should have, But anyway, I was just reacting to, I believe there is community will to take this on. I'm not sure it's street outreach workers, but I will say that we got our hats handed to us by going into community and saying, we're sending community organizers in to help you organize around the domestic violence issue. And they said, you ain't organizing nothing in our community. You can maybe help us mobilize our community, but you ain't organizing it. And so we changed the whole name. I mean, the language was meaningful, and even that little lesson was lost. But, there were some definite community leaders, like block club types, that came up out of that. So, what that means in terms of research, Chris, I don't know, but I had to babble a little bit about that project.
Well, you know me, I think that research and organizing are closely tied together.
We're at about time, a little bit over time. I just want to thank all of you for being part of this. This was a very informative panel. And yes, it's been very useful. I'm sure for many of us, we have some really good comments in the chat as well. So again, thank you so much for taking the time to be part of this. Christine, do you have any final things you want to say before we go ahead and wrap it up?
Well, no, I just think that this gives me a lot of energy. And as usual, it raises a lot of questions. And I just hope that, you're all doing great work, and we just have to figure out a way of continually communicating and coordinating together. I think that is really important, and we don't do we don't do enough of it. We try to, but we're all overwhelmed. But I think that's the key. I think that's of the even of what research happens, that it happens in a way that's really moving the agenda of a safety and empowerment forward. Thank you so much. This was great.
And thank you, Curl, for being here in our community, engaging in responsible research. Thank you.
We so appreciate all of the meaningful results and work and findings you've given us. And Chris and Teresa, I'm going to send you, I have like an 11-point list of research we would love to see. One of our research.
Hey, great.
Leave it to Apna. Leave it to Apna.
Yes.
Well, thanks again for everybody joining us, and for those of you who presented today, giving up some of your valuable time. We appreciate these partnerships so very much. So thank you.